Now. Okay, good. All right, so onward. So the first of the seminars on the list here is the ESPM seminar, which is held in 132 Mulford Hall. That will be tomorrow from 3:30 to 4:30, and the speaker is Rebecca Albright, excuse me, from the California Academy of Sciences, and her title is Coral Sex in the City: Ex situ Sexual Reproduction in Corals as a Tool for Scientific Discovery and Reef Conservation. IB seminar tomorrow is from 12:30 to 1:30. It's actually being hosted by Ron Chris Martin. The speaker is Stephanie Aguillon, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, from Stanford University, and the title is Integrating Genomics and Behavioral Ecology to Understand Speciation. There is an Essig brunch seminar on Friday from 10 to 11. And the speaker is Royce Cumming, a PhD candidate at City University of New York and the American Museum of Natural History. The title of that presentation is Evolution, Taxonomy, and Systematics of Leaf Insects, Phylidae. We have a botany lunch on Friday from 12 to 1 in 1002 VLSB. The speaker is Chris McCarran, an IB graduate who's currently at the Great Basin Institute and Whiskeytown National Recreation Area, and the title is Whiskeytown, a gold mine of botanical treasures. It's a great title. We have Herp Group on Monday at approximately 5 p.m. It will be 5:15-ish or so, which will be here in the GML. And there's going to be two presenters, both of whom are from Vance Friedenberg's lab. Bria Boos is a master's student in the lab at SFSU. And Bria Boos's title is Assessing Conservation Threats to Bay Area Amphibians. And then Max Taus, another master's student in Vance's lab, will be giving a presentation, Herpetofaunal Community Composition and Disease Dynamics in Bay Area Oak Woodlands. And after her group, there will be dinner at Lucky Hills. And the next MPZ lunch seminar next week from 12 to 1 is the speaker is Sylvia Pavan. Yeah. Sylvia is a professor and curator at the Vertebrate Museum at Cal Poly Humboldt. So the old Humboldt State University is now Cal Poly Humboldt. And her title is Fieldwork Exploration and Collections-Based Research to Unveil Diversity and Evolutionary History of American Small Mammals. And now I'm going to turn the floor over to Michelle, who's going to introduce the speaker.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you, Jerry Emory, for being here. It's my great pleasure. I'm going to stand over here so Carly can see me. To introduce our speaker today. He's got 4 decades of conservation experience. He's worked in so many different organizations that I'm not going to have time to list them all, but I'll just to give you a sense of some of that. He's written dozens of articles, and I actually ended up counting like 80 publications about environment, science, conservation, often about Western United States, but also Latin America. He's the author of 6 books in San Francisco Bay, including the San Francisco Bay Shoreline Guides and the Monterey Bay Shoreline Guides. And actually, there's a whole series of them on your website that were really interesting, including my favorite, the Bay Area Backroads book, which I've read, but didn't realize that you were the author of. And today he's going to be talking about this one. So I have a physical copy that was donated to the MVZs, a signed copy. So you're welcome to take a look at that. We can actually pass it around too. He's also spent, so let me give you a little sense of where he spent some of his time. He's been at he spent a year in the 80s at the Charles Darwin Research Station in the Galapagos. He's also been in the Brazilian Pantanal, where he did his master's work. He's worked for the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. He's worked for the California States Parks Foundation, as well as the Save the Redwoods League, which, you know, many of you know we've had connections with through Dave Wake. He lives here in the Bay Area, so obviously most of your work's been focused here lately, but this work that we're going to hear today is really spans a huge diversity of places and time periods, and really is an intimate portrait of, I think, the early days of MVZ and the National Park Service. So this is really a special treat to have you come here. I got to know Jerry, though, over the years of his intense research in the MVZ archives over, 10 years maybe?
At least, yeah.
At least 10 years. I mean, it's been a long time. So he's had to survive going the transition from our archivist, Christina Fiddler, to our current crew. And so this is sort of the culmination of a lot of that intense research. So it's really a pleasure to have you come and let us know about it. There's also some fun facts that we like to share about our speaker. So before I do that, there's actually two fun facts. One, I hope you'll tell us about your more intimate family connection to George Meléndez Wright, but also Jerry apparently is a garlic grower enthusiast, and he says he had 4 to 5 varieties every year, but this past season he harvested 125 heads of garlic. So this is like some serious garlic obsession.
I did not consume this morning.
Yeah.
I know when and when.
So, yeah, maybe the next book will be about vampire hunting. I'm not
Yeah,
sure,
I-
but anyways, thanks and welcome.
Thank you very much. You have to stand in just the right spot here. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank the staff here. Not only Michelle mentioned our long connection, but prior to Christina, there was Karen Klitz, who was the archivist here years ago that helped me out. And then Christina Fiddler, who's moved on to the Bancroft. And then Michelle, of course. And I was actually a grad student here on campus in the early 80s over in geography, which is where I went down to the Brazil and wrote my master's on the Brazilian Pantanal. And I was able to take Zoology 107, which was amazing. It was like one of the best things I ever did here. In fact, I still have my field book. It's in my library. And I was looking through it the other day. And I read this, and I'm like, I really missed out. I should have been a zoologist. I mean, there's a species account of an alligator lizard over at Point Pinole. Sorry, it's not a mammal, Jim. Biting abilities demonstrated by volunteer who offered his finger, which was accepted by the male. It proved relatively difficult to extract. Incredible writing, right? Anyway, when I took that course, Ned Johnson taught ornithology. Harry Green was the herpetologist, and then this man right here was my mammal professor.
The great triumvirate.
It was, and that was a long time ago. And so, I don't know, Jim, maybe 5 years ago or so, we reacquainted. And of course, I mean, he wouldn't remember me. So many students have come through, but I remembered him. And he has given very generously of his time, mostly just thinking about stuff, thinking about what it was like back then to be a biologist, a field biologist back in the 20s and 30s, in the history of this place. So the way I met, so thank you.
Not quite that old.
No. Well, maybe between the two of us. We always had a very good time in his office. So how did I meet George Wright? So 40 years ago, I was on this campus and I met a young woman. Started dating, fell in love, and we got married. And we're still married. She's right over here, Jeannie Lloyd. And this is not why I was attracted to her, but it turns out she's one of George Wright's granddaughters. And so I met George Wright through Jeannie, and then eventually her mom, my mother-in-law, who's still with us. And things just started rolling from there. Now, here's a picture of Michelle reading my book. This is my favorite picture. This is real field work here.
People want to know where I go when I'm not here.
Yeah. Anyway, I thought I'd throw it in just for you. So let's talk about George a little bit. And talk about why he was important to the Park Service and as an early scientist, and how Berkeley, and in particular the MVZ, was the shaping factor in his life. So he was born in San Francisco, a local boy in 1904. This is his father, John Wright. And he came from a long line of steamship captains in San Francisco, starting in the gold rush. And he was in the import-export business, and he went up and down the Pacific coast a lot, working with his agents to import mostly coffee and sugar and exporting finished goods. And one time he was in El Salvador, and he met this young, beautiful woman, Mercedes Meléndez, and they got married in San Salvador in 1892, and eventually moved to San Francisco. And he started his business out of San Francisco. It was very successful. And they had 3 boys, John or Juan, George, and then a younger brother, Carlos or Charles. And it was a bilingual household. I've looked back at census data and on Laguna Street over there in San Francisco, and it was always filled with a lot of Meléndez relatives and other Salvadorans that worked for John Wright in his business. So that's just an important thing to note. Unfortunately, by the time he was about 8 or 9, this picture is from 1913 up on Mount Tamalpais. Both his parents were dead for a variety of ailments at the time. And so this is an unnamed Salvadoran relative with him. This is when you used to be able to take the ferry across, right, and then catch the train, and then catch the train up to the top of the mountain where there was a dance hall and beer hall up there. So he was raised by a great aunt who he just called Auntie, and they started a pretty intense relationship at that time. Both of his brothers were sent back to El Salvador to be raised, and they just stayed there. But Auntie, as he called her, and George stayed in San Francisco, and she made sure he had plenty of tutors and other people teaching him above and beyond his regular schooling. And but his real passion was being outside and bird watching in particular. That was his entree into bigger things out in the natural world. And he was really active, total nerd, Boy Scouts, joined the Sierra Club early, went on the high country trips up into the Sierra. And again, it's just him and at this point, like a 80-year-old woman who was, she eventually adopted him. And he also took some extension courses from Berkeley when he was about 13. They had these extension courses called 6 Trips Afield to try to get the public to go out and about and learn about the natural history. And it was geared for adults, but he wrote a letter to Harold Bryant, who we'll talk about in a little while, and sent his check, and then he'd take the ferry over and he went on those. He went to Lowell High School where he was school president, wrote for the newspaper, and he started an Audubon Society there, of which he was the president. And by the time he was 16, he entered Berkeley. And he started out by declaring forestry as his major, which was really puzzling to me once I really started getting into the research. And you can see him here with this nice little hat on, maybe it's Montana peak hat or something. And he and Auntie bought a house on the North Potomac campus, and they just moved over here. They were always together, pretty much. He joined the DUs and just started taking classes. This is Walter Mulford, very formal portrait of Mulford in his elderly years. But he was a very prominent American forester, and I mean Mulford Hall, which was built at in his name. And I contacted the Forestry History Society and asked them why George Wright might have declared forestry as a major. And it made sense after this guy named Jamie Lewis, who's the head there and produces their publications, and I think it might be the ED. He explained that actually forestry at the time was part of the conservation movement in the United States, and it was also part of something called the progressive movement during the 20s and early 30s. And the progressive movement was basically taking science and applying it to problems in society. And so forestry was trying that. So beginnings of conservation and forestry, and also they were talking about recreation possibilities on Forest Service lands back then. They didn't have anything developed yet. So that kind of explains that. But here's the main man that I think really shaped Wright's temperament behavior and really his mind, I think. Is obviously Joseph Grinnell, and not much, I don't need to say much about him, except that Wright was completely intimidated by this guy. You know, George Wright was 5'4", and he was 16, right? And so he, even though he had traveled a little bit, he was pretty fresh. And here was this older Victorian guy who he just looked strict, right? And but eventually, just to cut to the quick, they became really good friends and really depended on one another once Wright got into the Park Service. I'll talk a lot more about him in a minute. And this is a great photo I found of Joseph Dixon, Joseph Scattergood Dixon, an amazing individual who followed Grinnell up from Southern California, became the economic mammologist here at the museum. You know, more needs to be known about this guy. He wasn't a real social person, but he was an amazing field biologist. And I mean, just look at the volumes of his field notes over here, publication list, you name it, and also his photography, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so Wright found Dixon, or maybe the other way around, and they soon became very close. Dixon was about 20 years Wright's senior. This is a much better picture of Dixon on the standing up. By the way, that was a bear den in Yosemite. It's like, oh, there's a bear den. Let's hop in there and just go take a look at it. So this is Dixon with the glasses on, and Harold Bryant, probably at the Yosemite Field School, you know, years later. Harold Bryant was, and Jim, please correct me, he got his PhD here in ornithology, and it might have been Grinnell's first PhD.
It was either his first or it may have been the year before Grinnell actually finished his PhD and became an official professor.
Correct.
So he may have gotten his degree under Charles Folkoway.
Yeah, but definitely one of the first early guys. Harold Bryant went on to not only work for the state Fish and Game, if it was called that back then, and then the Park Service for years and years, and he eventually became Wright's boss in the Park Service, which we'll touch on. Wright's academic records were lost, so he was here about 6 years at Berkeley, and but what's really interesting is what he did during his summer times, and I was able to piece together what he did during his summers, that whole period, and I think it really is indicative of what his trajectory was once he joined the Park Service. So the first summer, and I like to think it's because he was listening to Grinnell and Dixon, who had spent a lot of time in Alaska, which was still seen as, you know, not an unknown land by any means. Obviously, people had lived up there for thousands of years, and the Russians had been up there. But in terms of American science, it was still a relatively unknown spot. And so they were always trying to encourage their students and biologists to go up there and discover things and just, you know, go collecting. And so Wright and a Salvadoran relative, probably a cousin, went up for several weeks, the Inside Passage. This is the Mendenhall Glacier, far north of Juneau. The next summer, excuse me, he went on a Sierra Club high country trip into the Kings Canyon. You know, obviously he knew what he was doing with mules and horses. He'd been up there several times. And in 1924, with two of his DU buddies, this is a photo from a journal that he kept called The Pilgrimage of Ponderous Peter, and that Peter's the car. And I mean, they were just the small little engine, a little bit of metal, and then big bike tires. And what he wanted to do, and it was his organizational thought behind all this, was to go visit all the national parks in the West. It was pretty amazing. He's 20 years old, beat up old Model T, and they did it. They were gone for a couple months, 72 tire changes. And also reading that journal, actually, I looked at this the other day and I thought, oh, look, George is coming back from Burning Man. But he wasn't. They were out and about. And although here's another picture, it looks kind of like Burning Man. Yeah, can you imagine? But we know from the journal from 1924 that in 1923, he had already done that same circuit, maybe a couple different parks, with Robert Sibley, as in Sibley Regional Park, who also was probably about 15 years older than Wright, but was already a good conservationist, and they were kind of hiking partners when they were here on campus. And they had gone out and done the whole circuit. And Wright was already beginning to take pictures. I think, again, Dixon's influence. Dixon was one of the first adapters of seriously using photography as an addition to the basic field work. You had to do all the basic stuff. You had to keep your journal. You had to do all the collecting. You had to do all that. But then he was lugging around these gigantic cameras and even movie cameras. And I haven't been able to find all the movies he was taking, but found a lot of the photos. And a lot of the photos are here also, obviously. But this is not bad for, a young guy. And in his photography, he kept on getting better. But he was a forestry student. And in 1925, during that summer, he went on a bunch of forestry field trips. This is out in West Marin. And there's a great collection of photographs called the Fritz Metcalf Photography Collection in the library here in this building. And this is a very funny photo, I think, because George Wright's a short guy on the right with the really dirty pants. And there's no explanation. This is the forestry class photo from May of 1926. And it's like he didn't get the memo. And the guy next to him is also pretty dirty. But, they're happy. And this is over on the steps of Hillgard Hall. Mulford wasn't built yet. And so he was supposed to graduate that year, but he was given an offer to go with Dixon to Alaska as an unpaid assistant for the summer. So, Mulford and Grinnell, I've read their correspondence here, and they worked really closely together early on, very complimentary of one another. Grinnell would go and lecture in Mulford's classes and probably vice versa, but I think it was mostly Grinnell to Mulford. And I think they probably just came up and said, okay, well, let's give him another year because Alaska is going to be great for him. And so he went. And they went to McKinley for almost 3 months. And this is just a simple photo by Dixon from that summer. I got this here, obviously. And, this is now obviously Denali. And Wright demonstrating the classic Grinnellian field note system here. It's page 1 from McKinley. And I can't read all my notes here because there's some I can see people who are listening. So let me, anyway, they hiked about 500 miles and mostly they were like on a daily basis. Sometimes they go up for like 20 miles at a pop, with the shotgun, knapsack, maybe some hardtack. They also subsided off us like hardtack and canned chipped beef. They were put up in a little log cabin and they worked out of that for all those months, just collecting. And then on really bad days, weather-wise, they would, prepare their skins and all their specimens. They also took 350 photographs and recorded about 400 pages of field notes, if I can read around that person.
You should be able to move the people that are on Zoom. Yeah.
Can you maybe show me how to do that? I'd appreciate it. Kind of an old dog. Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So Wright really, this is where he cut his teeth on what it entailed to be a field person and collecting. And it completely changed his life and really bonded those two. I mean, you're living in a little log cabin for almost 3 months. You're either going to get along or not. And the expedition, which was common back then, this is another Dixon photo, beautiful, right? Was underwritten by a guy named John Thayer, who was a very wealthy East Coast collector. And this is pretty common, the MVZ, especially with Dixon. People wanted Dixon in the field. And so Dixon they would pay him a lot more than he was making here. So he would ask for a leave for a month or two and get that extra salary. Dixon already had at that point, I think 4 kids or something. So he had a large family. And so So Thayer paid for the trip. It actually took several years to actually get it together for a variety of reasons. There was a really bad flu epidemic on the Berkeley campus one year. And but what Thayer really wanted out of all, he wanted a couple of shorebirds, he wanted a wandering tattler and maybe something else, but he really wanted the surfbird because the surfbird had not been discovered yet, or the nesting site of a surfbird had not been discovered. And so it was a really big deal in ornithological circles. And so, of course, who found it? George Wright. Dixon was back in camp with a sore ankle, which must have been really sore because Jim and I have joked about all the stuff we know about Dixon and what he went through in the field, broken arm. Oh, I'm just going back to Berkeley. I'll be right back. Being stuck, up by the North Pole, overwintering. No big deal. I just missed my wedding. There's no way to tell my fiance. It only took him 1.5 years to get back. No big deal. But Wright went back to camp and said, I found it. And of course, Dixon at first was like, hey, he's joking. And this is all from field notes, which are right here in this room. And they hustled back with all the camera equipment, and they stood guard over it for like overnight. And this is an Alaskan summer night, so it was pretty light, but it was freezing. And Dixon took a whole bunch of photos, and then they did what they did best, and they collected everything. Right? It turned out it was a male, and I won't nerd out on why that was, but so it turns out that this is still at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, because everything was shipped back to Thayer, and when he died, he donated his collection of hundreds of thousands of different items to Harvard. And so I called back there and actually verified that, because at first I thought it was going to be here, but we couldn't find it. And then I realized through the notes, what happened. So that was a big deal for Wright. He came back to campus, and in the winter, early winter and spring of 27, he started an internship here at the MVZ with Grinnell and Dixon on museum techniques, whatever that entailed. And so he was here for 4 months, and then as a forestry student, you had to go to Camp Cali Forest, cute name, up by Quincy, to do training up there. And he did that, and came back, and then by that fall, he had joined the Park Service. And here's one of those little light cameras that they used to carry around. And so he joined the Park Service in November of 1927 and started to learn how to work inside of a park as opposed to just visiting it from the outside. And Yosemite at the time was experiencing huge surges of tourists because they had just finished an all-season road, which I'm sure was still pretty basic. And the Ahwahnee Hotel had just been finished in 1927, which was a big attraction. So they needed more interpretive rangers, which is what he was. He almost got kicked out of the Park Service because he was too short, but that's a whole nother, you have to read the book about that. It's actually pretty funny. So this is what he started doing on a daily basis. He would give talks and walks, did a lot of research in the museum because he and Auntie had some resources. He was donating books to the library and to the museum. He would just buy them and leave them there. He met Horace Albright, who was the assistant director at the time in that park. Stephen Mather was the first director from 1916 until 1929, and then Horace Albright took over. And so he knew all these people. It was a much smaller world back then. So he's the guy here with the tie. And this is Auntie. We actually have a whole bunch of photos from the family, and we had a bunch of glass slides, and one said Cordelia Wright, and I remember holding it up with Jeannie, and we were like, there's nothing on this thing. I mean, there's like some dark little marks on it, but we brought it to a specialist, and he's like, no problem. I can pull a photo from there. And that's it. She moved up to Yosemite when he did, because they were always going to be together. Those are his hands down there on the right. And she moved into the Ahwahnee and lived there for a year. And so she was there for a long time with him, and he would go over pretty much every morning, evening, and bring her coffee, bring her meals, and just kind of hang out and talk with other people. She passed away that winter at December of 28 in the Wani. In the summer of 29, Wright had because he spoke Spanish, he was asked to host a woman named Maria Labrado, whose Awanichi name was Totuya, and she had been one of the last Awanichi in the valley in 1851, when they were run out by the Mariposa Battalion. And it's really an incredible thing. Another amazing Dixon photo, right? He took a series of them. Some of them are pretty funny. They're laughing together and doing other things, but there's some serious storytelling going on here. And I think that this really influenced Wright in several different ways. Because he realized that people had lived in most of these national parks. There wasn't a lot of evaluation in those days about displaced peoples of the parks and how to create them and indigenous rights. None of that stuff. There was very little analysis of what the landscape looked like before European Americans arrived west. It was something Wright and his colleagues thought about all the time, like what's pristine? They were trying to manage back to a pristine state, but what was that? I mean, we still discuss it, right? And so this meeting, I think they spent the day together with some other folks, and this encounter was written up in the Yosemite Nature Notes. She made some acorn meal. They walked around. She was talking about all the different original names of things that she could remember. So it was quite a monumental meeting. All this time that he was in Yosemite, he started thinking about the fact that he had already traveled through all the parks, right? When he was an undergraduate, and he knew things were not right, that animals were out of sync, the wildlife certainly wasn't pristine by any means, and there was no science that had been done. And so because of being well trained by Grinnell and Dixon and Mulford, he began coming up with the idea of a wildlife survey in the large western national parks to be able to make science-based management decisions on what to do in the parks regarding wildlife. And it was a kind of a radical idea. And in fact, I have a letter that one of Dixon's sons gave me that was written by George Wright when he was in Yosemite to Dixon, basically saying, "Am I crazy? Or just visionary?" And it turns out I think he was probably a little bit of both, to be so bold to do that. But this whole time he was running this idea past Dixon. His boss at the time in Yosemite, a guy named Carl Russell, was another thought partner, and a guy he met in Yosemite named Ben Thompson, who I'll show you in a minute. And eventually he came up with this idea to create this survey and just go for it over like a 3-year period. And he convinced Albright, who signed off on it, who was the director of the Park Service. And Wright paid for the first 2 years of the survey out of his own pocket, and the salary of 2 guys that he was going to be working with. And excuse me. And the idea was to, like I said, to document what was going on in the parks, and then be able to. He also insisted that he'd be able to write up his findings in a report. And Albright said yes to all that. And you have to remember also what's going on here. In October of 29, like a month after Albright said yes, was the stock market crash in the beginning of the Depression, right? But Wright had already put some money away in a trust in San Francisco for 2 years to pay for the survey, and then the Park Service was going to pay for the third. And also, North America was suffering a prolonged drought. So think about what happened with the Dust Bowl, which was not only drought, but also human-caused issues. And then eventually, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, came on in 1933. May of 1933, he was brought on as president. And then we have in the height of the Depression, and but we also have the CCC created, which I'll talk about in a minute. A lot of emergency money that was made available to parks, and Wright was able to take advantage of that. So this young guy came up with that idea, and here's the trio. Right? I mean, this is so funny. I've never seen it. I have one picture of him smiling. And the belts are amazing. So this guy, Ben Thompson, Wright had met Ben Thompson in Yosemite. He was a waiter in the Ahwahnee. He met him when he was going over to visit his aunt all the time. And he was a philosophy student from Stanford. And he was going to be going back to his PhD program. And long story short, Wright said, no. Here's what you really need to do. You need to go to Berkeley, get a master's under Grinnell, and then join me in the Park Service. And he did. So, and they were best of friends and thought partners. And this also encapsulates, I think, their personalities very well. Because Thompson, I knew Ben Thompson and interviewed him in 1987 about the early years. And all he talked about was Wright's personality and ability to convince people of his way of looking at things, which is also something you read about regarding with Grinnell and Mulford and Dixon. Those three guys, they were all birthright Quakers. And you can have to, which I really dove into. They weren't practicing Quakers, but I think it influenced their personalities and the way they interacted with people and their philosophy about conservation, which the Quakers adopted early on. Anyway, so Ben Thompson was just saying that Wright was a good leader of people and was always a very good listener. And but he always usually won the argument, just like Grinnell. So Wright also bought a brand new vehicle and had it tricked out, had it custom made, took the back off, had waterproof cabinets put in the back. And this is also a funny picture. This is over at Lake Merritt because they have their uniforms on. And I think Wright took this picture and he sent it back to the DC office saying like, hey, look, here we are in our nice uniforms. They never wore them again, right? I mean, they're out in the field the whole time and they were just grubby and like sleeping out the whole time. And mostly, you know, through a country like this, right? This is Steamboat Rock, this is Yellowstone. So they started these cycles for 3 years. They had an office over in Hillgard Hall. And originally it started right downtown Berkeley, but then they moved into Hillgard Hall, where also the Park Service had education department. So there's, as we all know, a super close tie between the Park Service and UC Berkeley. And the wildlife team at that point moved in there, and they'd go out from early spring until late fall doing all their field work. Sometimes mostly together, but sometimes separate, and then come back and during the winter write up their notes, do research, correspondence, all that good stuff. And they started working on their first report. So Wright spent a lot of time in Yellowstone, almost 7 months total in 3 years. And one thing he did was help save the trumpeter swan, which was down to like, I think 20 individuals at the time in the park. He didn't know it at the time, but there was a small population in Canada. And then they discovered a smaller population at Red Rock Lakes, which is now a wildlife refuge. And everywhere they went during their research, they did the same protocol. They would always sit down and talk with the superintendent, to talk with the head ranger, ask them about their problems, ask them when they last saw a wolf, when the last time they saw a mountain lion, when's the last time they saw a grizzly bear. We're in Yellowstone, that was no problem, but they were trying to get a sense of the history of the fauna in the region. They go and interview old timers and ask them the same set of questions, and also things like, when did sheep show up? You know, livestock, when did livestock show up? Because overgrazing was a huge issue. Bear control was a huge issue. This is one of the dumps in Yellowstone. An incredible photo, right? And it's a 4 full plate. I'm not quite sure what that means, but there's 4 of them, and they certainly are eating. Dixon and Wright were just amazed at the number of grizzlies they could see at the dumps. I mean, at one time, I think Dixon had something like 8 or 9, and he was in his movie finder, and in his notes said, "Oh my God, you know, I'm never going to see this many again." Wright only saw 1 live or wild grizzly in his entire time zooming around. But the control of, I mean, the bear problem, which we still have in parks, obviously started quite early. I mean, I could talk for an hour about that. Also, one of their big interests was the status of pronghorn, which also kind of surprised me. And but thanks to Jim, he put me in touch with a colleague of yours that knew something about pronghorn.
Yeah.
I forget his name right now, but
Dave Brown.
yeah, he educated me about the importance of pronghorn at the time and why they were a object of conservation efforts. They had been an ecological kind of cohort with bison, right? And their numbers were huge at one point, but so they were always looking for proper habitat also where they could be reintroduced. Overgrazing was a huge issue that impacted them a lot, impacted the parks a lot. And they documented it everywhere they went. I mean, one time Dixon was in Mesa Verde by himself, and he counted like 5,000 sheep, in the park. And those guys knew how to, estimate, right? I mean, I was even taught that here in, Zoology 107, like you see a flock of birds and just kind of like, that's 123. Actually, I'm not that good. And predator control was a huge problem in the Western United States. So I got to read you some stats here. The U.S. Biological Survey, which we were talking a little bit about before, actually did really interesting stuff when it first started in the 1880s here in the West. They basically wanted to discover what was out here. But they also, during the 19-teens and early 1900s, there was a portion of the Biological Survey that was in charge of predator control. And they really went out of control with predator control. And that was a huge issue for Grinnell. And so therefore Wright and most of the Park Service, but not all the Park Service. So between 1916 and 1928, almost 8,400 wolves, 325,000 coyotes, 1,900 mountain lions, 36,000 bobcats and lynxes, 1,300 bears, countless numbers of prairie dogs and other mammals were killed by the Biological Survey. In the parks and outside of the parks, they worked in conjunction with them. And the parks oftentimes invited them in because the culture at the time was that it was just a carryover from the first European Americans that moved west. They wanted the whole landscape devoid of predators so they could grow their livestock and also, have their horses in the parks and all sorts of stuff and not have to worry about it. And those numbers are low. Those are the numbers of animals that they counted, right? And we all know that what happens when you give an animal strychnine, if they're not in a leg trap, they wander off, right? And they wouldn't bother chasing those things down. But I went back and read every single one of their annual reports, and they would always list with pride in the front, the Biological Survey, how many animals they had killed the previous year. And Grinnell was just, he was one of the leaders in the United States, along with a lot of other people from museums and academia, arguing that these people were out there killing with no basis, no scientific basis, and no control. There was no one out there that really knew anything about biology. And these guys were just like local hunters. His article, Grinnell's article from 1916 that he wrote, Restore, is really amazing. And that's when the Park Service was created in 1916. They wrote an article maybe in Science called Animal Life as an Asset of National Parks in 1916. If you go back and read that now, it's really phenomenal. Talking about predators, the need for dead snags, the need for parks for wilderness, the need for parks for the human spirit and health. And everything listed in that article, if you then move forward and read Wright's notes in his writings, the direct line. So their photographic system was pretty phenomenal. The Wildlife Survey took total about 14,000 photos. And they had the system, you've seen the photos, they had the slide, they had the card, they had a print, and they typed exactly where it was so that you could go back and check it out. And I found out that in the course of the research that they were all in their original boxes, originally how they were filed back at Harper's Ferry, which is a national park facility. And I was completely blown away. And the archivist there, one named Nancy Russell, we wrote an article together about this that appeared in the Park Stewardship Forum. She had an idea of being able to scan all of them and have the metadata put on every single photo. so that you can have them online. So you could just go search. And we found sufficient funds to do that. So during the pandemic, they had two grad students who worked not in the same room, but because of protocol, they scanned everything, added all the metadata, and now you can go online and take a look at them. And I'm telling you, I think Dixon needs to have a photographic retrospective or something. I think he has some amazing photos. So I mentioned they wanted to write a report. They actually ended up writing two reports, but they wrote Fauna 1 here on the left, finished it in 32. It came out in 33. And this was seen as a landmark document, according to the historian Richard West Sellers, just a radical departure from anything that the Park Service had ever been thinking about before. If you go to the back page of this book, there's 2 pages with 20 points, 20-point suggestion for management. And I'm not going to read them all, but things like the artificial borders of parks in the West also drove the team crazy, because it had nothing to do with faunal relationships with the environment. He insisted that before any kind of project that might impact plants or animals in a park, it should be thoroughly researched. Artificial feeding should stop. Presentation of animals should be wholly natural, which is what his way of saying there shouldn't be bear dumps. And the reason why he was so circular and diplomatic was because Horace Albright loved the bear shows. It would stop all predator control. Don't let native ungulates get overpopulated in the parks. And that was the whole problem with them migrating. Attempt to restore extinct native species if feasible, and restore extinct landscapes, they wrote, even though they didn't quite know what that meant or how to do it. And also stop sending animals from park to park in other areas, and that each park should have a complete faunal investigation, and he would refer to Grinnell's work in Yosemite as an example of that. But he wasn't all about birds and field work, so he got married to B. Ray, who was also a Berkeley graduate, and she joined them in the field for a while, and then this happened, which happens, and that's actually my mother-in-law there on the left. What a cute little button, right? She's turning 90 next week, and still very, very spunky. But the wildlife survey finished, they did the final books, and then a wildlife division was created, and he was put as the head of the wildlife division, and eventually began going back and forth to DC from Berkeley, and eventually moved to DC because he had to run it from there. And the office eventually moved from Hillgard Hall to DC. And at that point, with CCC funding and emergency funding in full swing, he was able to use that to hire more biologists in the parks. So by the end of 1935, he had about 27 biologists in parks, including his core 3, Thompson and Dixon, who were actually paid by the Park Service. The others were all on emergency funding. And Roosevelt was a huge fan of the parks and the outdoors, which was helpful for him. And what also started happening was the Wright started going on more special assignments. Here he is in Puerto Rico with Harold Bryant on his right, actually, looking at potential parks. He was also involved in the Everglades early on. And again, here's Harold Bryant and Wright. And this big tall guy here is Roger Toll, who was the superintendent of Yellowstone at the time. And at Yellowstone at the time, during the winter, they would just close it, right? There's barely any roads. There was no one there. And so he was always sent out on special assignment, and a lot with Wright, to go look at potential new parks. And throughout all these travels, Wright met all the luminaries of the day in the conservation world: Leopold, the Muries, John C. Merriam from here, Bob Marshall from the Bob Marshall Wilderness, a big wilderness advocate, who's also a forester, actually. They attended a lot of conferences at the time, conferences in 1935 and early 1936. And I'd better hurry up. So this is actually a picture by Ansel Adams in 1935 in Kings Canyon. And the Ansel Adams Trust always make sure I have to say this is a proof print by Ansel Adams, which I found in the Bancroft, believe it or not, because it's not a fine print and they control everything quite carefully by Ansel Adams, and rightly so. But this is the former past president of the Sierra Club, Philip Bernays, and then Ernest Dawson, who was the present Sierra Club president. And they got together in Kings Canyon to think about how to create Kings Canyon as a park. It wasn't a park yet. And so the Park Service and the Sierra Club were getting together and trying to figure it out. And Wright was assigned as the lead for the Park Service because he knew it like the back of his hand. And this is actually more what Ansel Adams was doing at the time. This is actually a print in a family album that the Lloyd family has. And it's glued into a big album, like a big old album. And it's an original Ansel Adams print. So, it can't be moved. I just took a snapshot of it. It can't be moved out. But I was able to take a chopstick and, look at the back and look at what's written on the back. And Ansel Adams had very distinct handwriting, especially his S's. And he wrote on, this is, on the back of this, it says Kings Canyon Project, 1935. And what he did was he printed up a bunch of these with Wright, because they knew each other and were buddies. And Wright invited him back to DC to a conference in January to try to lobby, because legislation was up. And these were leave behinds for politicians. They were 8.5 by 11 photos that he had printed up. So shortly after that conference I just mentioned, Wright was assigned to go down to the Mexican border with some colleagues as part of a US delegation. And think about this in today's context. It's really quite striking. To formulate policies and plans for the establishment and development of international parks, forest reserves, and wildlife refuges all along the international boundary between Mexico and the United States. That would have been nice. So they started down, this is Big Bend, this is St. Helena Canyon in Big Bend in late February of 1936. And Wright had a great time. It's the first time he'd been out in the field in a while. They did a flyover from Johnson's Field down there with his Mexican colleagues. These are great photos taken by someone named George Grant, who was the official National Park Service photographer at the time, who was on the trip. And there's dozens of them. This is a little town of Boquillas up here, Mexico. So this is Mexico and this is the United States. And it didn't always work. There were passages across the river, but oftentimes they had to just be dragged, and then they got delayed forever. But they had a great time. This picture is from deep in Mexico, actually, from Coahuila, Picacho Vaca, which is south of the Sierra del Carmen. And that's right stretched out here. And Roger Toll and their Mexican colleagues, and a couple other American engineer. And this was a local booster of the Big Bend National Park, which didn't come on until 1940 or so. And this is the last photo, this known of Wright. His Mexican colleagues had given him the nickname of Chapo, which isn't always associated with drug lords, right? Chapo is actually it's an endearing term for someone that's like short and tough, and he was short and tough. And unfortunately, 2 days after this photo, he and Roger Toll were in a car going to the next destination, and outside of Deming, New Mexico, got into a head-on collision, and both of them died. So the Park Service, in one fell swoop, lost like their two biggest conservationists and two incredibly well-respected people within the Park Service. And Wright his name had already come up as a potential director of the Park Service, even though he was only 31. But his legacy does live on. And this past spring down in Big Bend, I helped the retired superintendent down there, Bob Krumenacre. We put up an interpretive sign looking at Mount Wright there in the distance and talking about George Wright. And after Wright died, his personality went with him, and that cohesive gel to be able to keep together a team. And a bunch of other things started happening. The funding went away from the CCC. Thompson and Dixon knew they did not have the personality that Wright had. They just, I've read it in letters, and And actually Harold Bryant at one point wrote Grinnell and said about Dixon, no, he has to stay in the field. And probably out of respect, right? But a lot of the biologists went over to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when that was created in the early 40s, and the war happened. Then post-war, the emphasis in the parks was on infrastructure because they had been neglected for a long time. And it wasn't, science didn't really come back into the parks until the early 60s with the A. Starker Leopold report in 1963, who was a product of the MVZ, but had an office across the way. And slowly it picked up steam over the years to have more science-based management in the parks. And by 1980, the George Wright Society was created by the two top biologists in the Park Service to bring together land managers and scientists to look at a series of issues in the parks that Wright was dealing with 50 years before, which is one of the reasons why they named it after him, but also because of the Fauna 1 and 2, which he was the principal author of in his groundbreaking work. The introduction, I'm not trying to sell books, but the introduction of the book is written by John Jarvis, the former director of the Park Service under President Obama. And he talks about, he started in 1980, right when there was this new surge of science, emphasis on science in the parks. And they were all looking back to Wright even then. And they were all, going back and reading Fauna 1 and 2 back then. So that's the legacy of George Wright. And this place right here shaped him and formed him. And the correspondence between Wright and Grinnell in the latter years of Wright's life are really incredible. He basically, even though his office was right across the way, it's really funny. It's just like old behaviors or something. Instead of coming over and like knocking on his door and talking, they would write back and forth. And, what is it, a 5-minute walk, 10-minute walk? But that's good for us, right? Because now we have the archives. And basically Wright said, I can't be doing what I'm doing in the parks right now without you and Joe. So that's that.